Hello guys and welcome back to another video. Now it has been quite some time since I've given you an update on the UNECE regulations, and this week I found the time to finally dive into the recent decisions and progress that has been made on the level 3 regulations, on the DCAS regulations and on the ADS regulations. So let's dive into it. So first thing I want to do is to talk a little bit about the level 3 hands-off driving. Now this was approved in Germany up to 60 kilometers an hour. It was also approved by the UNECE up to 60 kilometers an hour. So basically it was meant to be a traffic jam assistant at that point, because it was also only allowed on the highways. Now, the UNECE actually approved the speed increase up to 130 kilometers an hour. You could be in the same lane for 130 kilometers an hour. You could do that for a very long time while you have your cell phone in your hand, you're doing some emailing and that kind of stuff. So that is legally allowed by the UNECE. Now I was wondering whether or not it had already been implemented in Germany in the local regulations, and I want to give a shout out to Clemens Becher, a friend of mine who was so kind as to dive into these local German regulations to find out whether or not it had already adopted. And it turns out that the local laws have actually been adopted and adjusted to allow for the 130 km per hour speed in the same lane with the same restrictions, only in really nice weather and that kind of stuff, with no obstructions, with no tunnels, with no police coming from the back and that kind of stuff. So there are quite some limitations to the system, but if you can just put yourself in one lane, and that would be the rightmost lane, because you cannot drive constantly in the middle lane, for example. So you would be driving between the semi-trucks at that point. But in essence, you could write an email while driving, and this would be legal. Mercedes was the only company that actually had implemented this up to 60 kilometers an hour, and they have not yet implemented the speed increase. So maybe later this year they will update it, or maybe they will hold off on it because they think it's too risky. We don't have information about that, sadly. Now, a second topic is ADS. Now, it's not an acronym, but it means autonomous driving system. So there are 3 levels of autonomy, basically, or autonomous systems. One is ADAS, which is the Advanced Driver Assistance System, which is your traffic-aware cruise control and the staying within the same lane kind of stuff. It's kind of what autopilot is doing today. Then we have the autonomous driving system, which is level 3, 4 and 5, which will be fully autonomous driving. For level 3 in some cases, in some circumstances, for level 4 and 5 in almost any circumstance. With level 5 you don't even need the steering wheel anymore. Now the DCAS, which we'll talk about in just a minute, that is the driver control assistance system, which is the one and only regulation that we need to focus on in Europe to get FSD Beta approved here, because that is what it is aimed at. It's still a level 2 system, but a highly automated level 2 system. That means that it's kind of like a level 2 plus, where you still have to be fully engaged as a driver. However, it will do much of the driving for you, but you are still responsible for the actions and the behavior of the vehicle. Now, talking about autonomous driver systems, they're also working on that. So level 3, level 4 and level 5 autonomous driving regulations, which is good, because now is the time to work on that while we are still not on that level. So as soon as it is technologically allowed to do that, it will also be regulatory allowed to do that. So that is good that the UNECE is already working on that at this point. As for the timeline on this, there is some basic drafts going around and they are still working on it, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So the timeline for this right now is that it would be submitted to the WP29, so the Working Party 29, which is the governing body that has to finally decide whether or not to adopt the regulation. That would be for June 2024. Now, as the regulations usually take place in January or take effect in January, that would mean that as of January 2025, level 3 and maybe level 4, we'll see how much it will be in the regulations already, will be allowed in Europe and the other countries, of course, that are also joined by the WP29, which is about 60 countries in total, including South Africa, Australia, and others. So now let's get to the juicy bit, the part of the DCAS. Now there has been a study conducted where they wanted to see or to compare the hands-on versus the eyes-on driving, where the steering wheel nag would no longer be there and the system would measure your attentiveness by just looking at what you are doing, where you are looking, if you are still engaged in the driving process. So that would be really nice, that by just being attentive to the road, you won't have to touch the steering wheel every 15 seconds anymore. Now the study was conducted, the results were presented in the February session of the special interest group around autonomous driving, but there were still some questions, and actually one of the parties said, well, the results that you have, they are different from the previous results from previous studies that we did. So we would like to present those studies as well, and I guess there are some concerns that they don't match. Maybe it's the way that people are driving nowadays. I don't know which studies they are referring to. But in the end, there will be a written report for this study as well. So once that study is done and contains some interesting information, I will definitely report on that as well. Now, one of the limiting factors or the problematic factors is once again the Netherlands, who are asking questions, and maybe rightfully so, about the very fine line between the ADAS and the ADS. As said, at this point we are talking about a level 2 plus system where a lot of the driving will be done automatically by the car, but you are still responsible. And they are afraid that the driver will not be responsible and trusts the system way too much, and they want to avoid having accidents and because of driver inattentiveness at this point. But to counter that, there is within the DCAS regulations, there is a lot of emphasis on when it can be allowed to be used, what are the constraints in which it should be used or can be used, but also around monitoring the driver. So several parties are asking for really stringent driver monitoring at this point, to avoid that the driver would be distracted. Now, when looking at the draft document for the DCAS regulations, we see that there are still quite a few gaps that need to be filled out. So there has been some progress made, and I think there has been some really good progress made, because it becomes more and more clear that what they are aiming for or what they are implementing in the DCAS is actually almost a one-on-one match with what Tesla FSD is capable of doing in the US currently. So Tesla is really moving things forward on this front, and they are setting the pace, they are setting the standard for what this regulation is actually going to be. For now on, it is still hands-on, but as I mentioned before, they are talking about the hands-on versus eye-on system, where driver monitoring by camera could be enough maybe to allow the system to think or to judge that you as a driver are still actively engaged in the driving task. That would be really nice, because the 15-second nag is really annoying, especially in parts where we know that autopilot and the limited FSD functionality that we have, where it works great. Then the 15 seconds is complete overkill, but it is a safety feature at this point to make sure that you are actively engaged. If they can replace it by a camera view, then that would be awesome. Now, if we dive a little bit deeper into the DCAS regulation and the draft that is currently published by the UNECE, then we see that what is allowed is, for example, lane changes on roads with no divider and where pedestrians and cyclists are allowed. They actually have a funny way of saying it. They're actually saying where pedestrians and cyclists are not prohibited, which is the same thing, but I find it an odd choice of words. Now, for now, Autopilot cannot do any lane change where cyclists or pedestrians are allowed. So this would be a big step up for the functionality of the lane change. It also allows for moving out of the lane to drive around parked vehicles or slower moving traffic. So it can drive around dumpsters that are in the road, parked cars, cyclists or joggers that are moving slowly on the road. You can drive around it, and then it can leave the lane, what it can't do today, but then it can leave the lane for a tiny bit just to get around those objects. So again, that is also something that we really need when we want to do in-town driving. You won't actually encounter those kinds of things very frequently on the highway, maybe with an accident, something like that. But other than that, it's mainly geared towards urban driving. Now, what else we can do is it allows to leave the lane to create the virtual rescue lane. In like 7 or 8 countries in Europe, in the meantime, there are mandatory requirements to create a virtual rescue lane while you are in a traffic jam. This allows emergency vehicles to pass through the traffic jam really quickly, really fluently, so they can be quicker on site, and maybe it will save lives in the process because they are not losing time being stuck in the same traffic jam. Now, next to that, it's also talking about not just detecting the lane markings, but finding other means of detecting the drivable space as well as detecting the lane that you should be driving in. And this is something that Tesla is currently not very good at least here in Europe, that is finding the right side of the road. Because again, we are rather narrow roads, and if the lane markings, they just disappear at a certain point and you are alone on a two-way carriage, then it actually starts hunting for the middle of that road very frequently. So that is something that definitely needs improving. So it can detect the road curbs, it can detect the width of the road and then see, well, logically I should be on this side of the road, stuff like that. But it is also included in the regulations that the car should be able to do that because not all local roads have lane markings, of course. And then a very important one is that it's also talking about roundabouts and even lane changes on multi-lane roundabouts. This is something that we haven't seen in Europe anywhere yet, and it's very important because in Europe we love our roundabouts, and it needs to be able to switch lanes on roundabouts, especially for example for the turbo roundabouts where you have to take the inside lane if you want to move to the left, and if you take the outside lane you are obliged to either take the first right or to go straight on. You cannot move to the left at that point. So those are the things that Tesla will have to be able to do, and it has to decide upfront which lane do I need to take, and maybe it needs to switch lanes in between as well to pass objects, to pass cars, or when it's in the middle lane to exit to the right at the end. The regulations also allow for changing lanes just to follow a route. So again, you need to move into a specific lane to go to an intersection where you have to turn left, and also the turning left on an intersection that is included in the regulations. So they are fully committed to local driving with DCAS, the way that FSD Beta is capable now in the US. And I really like that they are moving into this direction and they are thinking about everything already. So it takes a lot of time to get there, but they are thinking of all the possible things so that everything is going to be allowed at once. And since it will take some time to actually get to that point, then of course by that time the FSD Beta in the US will have a lot of the child diseases, we call it. Maybe that's a Dunglish word, I don't know. But the initial hiccups, the initial bugs will be worked out by the time that we get it here in Europe. And if it's allowed and they flip the switch, it should be really good for us. Now the regulations go even that far that they include the static and dynamic road signs. It needs to be able to read those for making maneuvers, for example, on roadworks. They even go as far as to include the car being guided by emergency and enforcement instructions. So I guess that means that they want the car to be able to follow police instructions. Now, I think this could be a very tricky one because, well, it needs to judge the hand gestures of the policeman on the intersection, for example. That is definitely something that is going to be tricky to actually implement. But again, it's a level 2 system. They can determine up to which point they're actually going. It's not mandatory to do that, but then the system has to disengage at that point and say, hey driver, I don't know what to do here. You need to take over. Now I briefly mentioned the difference between a driver still being able to do a lane change manually versus the car actually deciding to do the lane change. When the car decides to do the lane change, it's fairly simple. The car needs to blink at least 3 seconds before it starts moving. And then again, the same distance regulations, you still need the same big gap that you always needed to get to do the lane change in a safe manner. I will link it up here for the full video. It's my initial video that I made on the regulations where I explain how big of a gap you actually need to be allowed to do a lane change. Now, as you will see in that same video, the lane change procedure when you do a manual lane change, that is actually quite a tricky one. The car can't move for 1 second, then it has 2 seconds to actually start moving, and then it needs to be between the 3rd and the 5th second, it needs to cross the line, which is very difficult to judge, especially in busy traffic. That makes it nearly impossible to use the automatic lane change with the driver initiating that lane change. So having the system being able to do that automatically, that's great. But also within the DCAS regulations, they are aiming to extend that period to 10 seconds. Now, one final thing is that with this lane change and the fact that you need such a big gap, that is that the regulations also specifically say that the manufacturer can deviate from those parameters when it's really necessary. So for example, if you're coming to the end of a lane, when you have to merge, that you don't come to a stop, you have to merge, and then it will be easier to merge in. You need not as big as a gap. The same for exit taking. You can't wait for 5 seconds before you take the exit or you have passed it. So again, it needs to change quicker on that front. And it also is aimed more at urban driving in dense traffic, where you have to move in between cars in an urban environment where you don't have 50 or 100 meters behind you to be able to do a safe lane change. Now here you see the timeline that they have from the actual document, and this comes from the January session, and they say that the DCAS master document review updated stages and timing. So we are here end of January, stage 2 with the detailed review that is being going on, and they want to agree on the content of the requirements. So they will have a draft ready for the September meeting, and then after that it will be fine-tuning, finalizing the details in stage 3, and this would be submitted to the GRVA in January and May 2024, and that would allow for a finalized version to be put forward for the June session of the WP29 in 2024. This is the update for the UNECE regulations up until the February sessions. There is a March session going on in the next week, and maybe we'll have some more details there as well. And then we'll have the collaboration that is going on to get to the final details for the ADS and the DCAS sessions. September 2023 is the next big step that we need to look forward to see if the draft is more or less already accepted or if there are still a lot of questions that need to be answered. Now, as usual, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and make sure you click that little bell icon so you don't miss out on any new videos. And for now, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye bye.